Welcome to the Hindu Daily.
Glad to be here for another one.
And welcome to today's deep dive. We've got a really fascinating lineup for you today.
We really do.
Yeah, think about this. What do a shortage of Korean instant noodles, a humanoid robot with a bionic spine, and like a 1920s Tamil stage play all have in common?
I mean, on the surface, absolutely nothing.
Right. But today, we are examining a stack of 10 incredible articles from the paper that all circle around one big theme. And that theme is the hidden, often really fragile networks that just keep our modern world running.
Yeah, it's all about systems.
Exactly. We'll be moving through today's newspaper sections sequentially to understand, how these systems operate, how they break under pressure, and ultimately how we rebuild them.
And we really do have a lot of ground to cover today. We're starting with how nations protect their borders, then we're moving into the crazy volatility of global supply chains, and we'll end by looking at the power of local communities.
It's a journey.
It is. And the goal today isn't just to, list the news for you, but to connect the dots. We want to figure out the underlying mechanisms that are actually driving these massive global shifts.
So let's start right at the top, in the editorial section, looking at the physical defense of a nation.
Right.
I was reading this piece on how India is architecting its defense strategy to offset China's military advantage. And the core issue here is that bridging this capability gap, it isn't just about throwing money at the military.
No, not at all.
It requires some incredibly hard policy choices because military tech is just evolving so much faster than traditional military doctrine.
It really forces a strategic crossroads for the country. India essentially has three paths it can take right now.
Okay.
The bold approach involves betting heavily on completely new, futuristic warfighting technologies, just skipping a generation entirely.
High risk, high reward.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then there's a conservative strategy, which involves taking emerging tech and just kind of bolting it onto existing in-service platforms.
Which is cheaper, I assume.
It is. And it might work for a very short, localized conflict. But then there is the middle path, which focuses on multi-domain operations, or MDO.
Okay, let's unpack this, because upgrading a nation's defense feels a lot like upgrading a computer to me.
That's a good way to look at it.
Right. Like, do you replace your entire system and risk the new one crashing right in the middle of a big task? That's the bold path.
Yeah.
Or do you just add a new stick of RAM to your 10-year-old desktop and just sort of hope for the best? That's the conservative path.
A Band-Aid solution, really.
Yeah. Or do you take the middle path, which would be upgrading the motherboard itself so it can support both your reliable old components and the new high-speed ones?
I love that. That motherboard analogy captures the mechanics of this perfectly. Because in military terms, that motherboard is made up of what the experts call enabling layers.
Enabling layer.
Right. India doesn't necessarily need a single, exquisite, super futuristic weapon to alter the balance of power. It needs to fix its C4ISR.
Oh, boy. That is a massive acronym.
It's a mouthful. It stands for Command, Control, Communications, Computers, Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance.
Wow. Okay, but essentially that just boils down to the see and fight battle, right?
Basically, yes.
If you can see the enemy, you can fight them. Which explains the urgent need outlined in the article for cheap, expendable ISR platforms. We are talking about, like, swarms of drones that a military can actually afford to lose in combat.
Yes, exactly. And the reason those expendable platforms are so crucial comes down to industrial capacity.
Because of China's scale.
Right, precisely. China has a massive missile inventory and the industrial might to just produce thousands more during an active conflict. If a war erupts, China could use those to drag India into a protracted, grinding fight.
And that would just chew through resources.
It would severely pressure India's surge capacity.
Yeah.
This is why the middle path has to involve removing red tape and incentivizing private industry.
Right, the government can't do it alone.
The government sector alone simply cannot manufacture drones and sensors at the speed and scale required to maintain deterrence. They need that private sector engine.
Which makes total sense. Now, we see a totally different kind of architectural upgrade happening in our second editorial piece today, but this one is taking place inside the courtroom.
Ah, yes, the language debate.
Yeah. So the Supreme Court released a handbook on combating gender stereotypes back in 2023, and it's currently sparking a massive debate. Recently, Chief Justice Surya Kant remarked that the handbook was, quote, technical and too Harvard-oriented.
The context there is really important to understand.
And I'll get through it.
During a hearing on a sexual assault case, the Chief Justice suggested the forensic terms in the handbook might not be readily understood by survivors or laypersons who are in the courtroom.
Oh, I see.
He actually called for a review panel to look at it. But the editorial argues this critique stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of who the handbook is actually for.
I have to ask the obvious question for you listening, though. If the language of the highest court in the land is too academic or technical, doesn't that block the everyday person from actually understanding the law?
It sounds counterintuitive, I know.
Yeah.
But the handbook is not a public relations document. It's not meant for survivors or laypersons to read at home.
Who is it for then?
It is a highly specific, functional tool designed for judges and lawyers.
Oh, okay.
These are professionals trained to craft reasoned legal judgments. Its entire goal is to target and remove the archaic, patriarchal language that has historically plagued Indian legal precedent.
And the historical examples in the piece are just jarring. I mean, look at the 2010 D. Velusamy versus D. Pachiamal case. The court actually used the word keep to describe a woman in a live-in relationship.
Yeah, it's pretty shocking to hear today.
It implies she was just a servant, or kept purely for sexual purposes, or, the historical reliance on the word ravished instead of rape.
And ravished is a perfect example of why this matters mechanically in law. That word carries these archaic, almost romantic connotations.
Like something out of a Victorian novel.
Exactly. Using it in a legal document completely obscures the reality of the violence. It ignores consent and bodily autonomy entirely.
Wow, yeah.
So the handbook provides this tabulated format of these stereotype-promoting words right alongside recommended neutral alternatives that are actually backed by case law.
So it's not Harvard-oriented at all.
No, it's deeply grounded in the reality of Indian courtrooms. Language shapes judicial logic. Ensuring that judicial language aligns with constitutional equality is just a crucial mechanism for internal accountability.
That makes a lot of sense. And, speaking of reevaluating traditional gender roles, that brings us right into the opinion section where there's a major shift being debated regarding childcare.
This is a huge conversation right now.
It is. Following a Supreme Court ruling on maternity leave for adoptive and surrogate mothers, the conversation has pivoted to a massive systemic question. Do Indian men need paternity leave?
The data driving this debate is stark. I mean, the Time Use survey shows that Indian women spend 10 times as many hours on domestic work, including childcare, compared to men.
10 times? That's incredible.
It is. And in the formal sector, this translates into a severe motherhood penalty. Women face significant wage gaps, or they're subtly nudged out of promotion tracks after having a child.
Because the systemic assumption is just that they are the default caregivers.
Exactly.
I was looking at Sweden's policy, which is basically the global gold standard here. They offer 480 days of shared paid leave.
That's amazing.
But implementing that is really complicated. There's this fascinating cautionary tale from U.S. universities regarding the tenure clock that the article brings up.
Oh, right, the academic extension.
Yeah. Both men and women were given a year's extension on their academic requirements for having a child. But the men use that parental leave to publish extra academic papers and advance their careers.
While the women actually struggled with the day-to-day childcare.
Exactly. So could a 6-month paternity leave in India just turn into a paid vacation where the father sits on the couch and orders his wife to make tea?
That concern is rooted in a very real cultural reality. To fix it, true gender justice requires shifting the legal terminology and the cultural expectation from maternity or paternity leave to a strictly non-transferable parental leave system.
Non-transferable meaning?
Meaning, if a father doesn't take his designated portion of the leave, the family just loses it. It forces shared responsibility.
Oh, I like that mechanism.
However, implementing this in India hits a massive roadblock.
Yeah.
90% of workers are in the informal sector.
Right. So a law mandating paternity leave wouldn't even apply to them.
Not at all. And for the formal sector, especially those nano businesses employing maybe 3 or 4 people.
Yeah, losing one employee to a 6-month leave could literally bankrupt the enterprise.
Exactly. There is also a persistent economic bogeyman argument to confront here. It's the idea that expanding labor rights, like menstrual or parental leave, makes women unattractive hires to corporate boards.
Which is incredibly unfair.
We cannot let that argument hold labor rights hostage. But we do have to acknowledge that expanding the size of enterprises and formalizing the economy is an absolute precondition. Without a formalized economy, these policies risk causing unintended discrimination.
We spend so much time engineering and debating the policies at the beginning of life, but the science section today highlights how little we plan for the very end. Let's look at the legal and medical mechanics of the living will.
This is a heavy topic, but a necessary one. A living will, or advance directive, is a legal document that safeguards an individual's treatment preferences if they develop an irreversible or terminal condition.
Like falling into a persistent vegetative state.
Right. We plan for everything else in life, yet the end of life is often left entirely to chance and just the default settings of a hospital.
So what does this all mean for you and your loved ones? I see a living will as almost like an emotional insurance policy you buy for your family.
That's a great phrase for it.
Because if the worst happens, you are saving them from the immense guilt and conflict of having to make the hardest decision imaginable while just standing there in a fluorescent hospital hallway.
Without that document, the default mechanism for doctors is to take the safest legal route, which means continuing every textbook treatment measure.
Keep the machines on at all costs.
Exactly. And this leads to what palliative specialists call a disconnected death. A terminally ill patient spends their final days in an ICU, attached to feeding tubes and ventilators, unable to speak, cared for by strangers.
That's heartbreaking.
It causes profound, prolonged distress for both the patient and the family.
It's important to clarify, though, that this only applies to terminal states. This isn't about a hospital giving up on you if you get in a car crash or have a highly treatable illness.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And it's strictly for conditions where there is no medical hope of recovery. If you have a living will that refuses ICU care for terminal cancer, but you come into the ER with a broken leg,
You still get the cast.
you still receive full treatment for the broken leg, yes. The Supreme Court of India legally recognized these directives, notably in the Common Cause 2018 case and the recent Harish Rana case.
Which was a huge victory for patient autonomy.
Massive. The process now just requires a drafted document, 2 witnesses, and a notary or gazetted officer. It shifts the end-of-life focus from prolonging suffering to providing palliative comfort care.
Having that safety net is so vital. But, if we switch gears to the global economy, moving into today's text and context section, we see a traditional financial safety net behaving very strangely right now.
You're talking about gold.
We are looking at gold. Historically, gold is the ultimate safe haven asset, right?
Usually, yes. During the 2008 financial crash, the COVID-19 pandemic, the invasion of Ukraine, gold prices surged as investors sought stability.
But since the West Asian conflict escalated recently, gold prices have actually fallen sharply. In India, 24-karat gold dropped from about 1.9 lakh down to 1.3 lakh rupees per 10 grams.
It's a massive drop.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Wait, central banks were just buying up physical gold specifically because it can't be frozen or sanctioned the way Russian financial assets were?
Right, they've been hoarding it.
So why aren't everyday retail investors doing the exact same thing right now to protect their wealth?
It comes down to a fascinating mechanism driven by the bond market. Let's trace the causality here. The war spiked global oil prices to over $100 a barrel.
Okay.
High oil prices immediately raise inflation fears. Everything gets more expensive to transport. To fight that inflation, markets expect central banks to keep interest rates very high.
I'm with you so far.
Now, physical gold yields no interest. It just sits in a vault.
Right, it doesn't pay out a dividend.
Exactly. So when interest rates are high, investors flock to U.S. government bonds instead because they offer a guaranteed high return.
Ah, okay. And because gold is priced globally in dollars, all that money flowing into U.S. bonds strengthens the dollar, which in turn makes gold even more expensive and less attractive for foreign buyers.
You nailed it. Add to that a severe liquidity crunch. The broader stock market has taken a hit due to the conflict. When retail investors face margin calls,
Meaning their broker demands cash to cover stock market losses.
right, they have to sell off whatever asset is still in profit. Gold has had a massive run-up over the last 2 years, so it's the first thing getting liquidated. Automatic sell orders get triggered, flooding the market with gold and driving the price down further.
But to your point earlier about central banks,
They're still quietly accumulating it. The underlying long-term demand remains very bullish, even if retail investors are temporarily fleeing to the dollar.
wow. Okay, while investors are fleeing traditional assets, there's a massive influx of capital into futuristic tech, which brings us to our second piece in the text and context section. We have an incredibly eye-opening interview with He Xiaoping.
The founder of XPeng Motors.
Yes, and XPeng is at the forefront of China's absolute dominance in the EV market. To put the scale in perspective for you, China's EV production is expected to exceed 16 million units in 2025,
It's staggering.
reaching a domestic penetration rate of 57%. But what Xiaopeng points out is that the market dynamics have fundamentally shifted. It is no longer a price war or a simple hardware switch from gas to electric.
It is a massive technological upgrade.
We really need to stop thinking of these machines as cars. It's not even a smartphone on wheels. It's more like driving inside a learning operating system.
Xiaopeng calls this embodied intelligence. The industry is seeing a total convergence between traditional automakers and tech giants, like Xiaomi.
The phone maker.
Exactly. Xiaopeng argues that whoever controls the in-house integration of hardware and software for this embodied intelligence will control the next decade of mobility.
And they are taking this way beyond just cars on the road. XPeng is pushing aggressively into robotics.
This is where it gets like science fiction.
It really does. They have a humanoid robot called Iron with a bionic spine and flexible skin, which is launching into mass production in 2026. Plus, they are pioneering what they call the low-altitude economy.
Their land aircraft carrier, which is essentially a flying car.
It's wild.
And it is entering mass production. They have built an assembly line that rolls out one aircraft every 30 minutes.
Every 30 minutes.
That is 10 times more efficient than traditional aviation manufacturing. This integration of AI, automotive manufacturing scale, and aviation is unlocking trillion-dollar markets in light aircraft, low-altitude infrastructure, and air mobility services.
But building those flying cars and robots requires a flawless global supply chain. And moving into the business section today, we see just how fragile that chain really is.
It's incredibly fragile.
We are looking at the severe disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz due to the Iran war.
The Strait of Hormuz is a geographic bottleneck. It handles roughly 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas.
A fifth of the world's supply.
Yeah. And Asia is uniquely vulnerable because of its heavy reliance on Middle Eastern crude. What we are seeing is how a disruption in fundamental raw materials cascades instantly through every single layer of consumer goods.
Which brings up a crazy question. Is the modern world really so interconnected that a conflict in one strait means you can't buy instant noodles in South Korea or a bottle of water in India?
The short answer is yes, and it's because of a specific chemical mechanism. The acute shortage right now is in something called naphtha.
Naphtha? What is that?
Naphtha is an oil derivative. It serves as the fundamental building block for making plastics and synthetic rubber. Because the naphtha supply is choked from the conflict, South Korean ramen giants like Buldak and Nongshim are facing severe shortages of the PT plastic used in their packaging.
Over a plastic wrapper.
Exactly. K-beauty brands can't get the plastic pots for their cosmetics. In Japan, Yamayoshi Seika had to halt production of their famous potato chips because they couldn't get the heavy boiler oil needed to fry them in their factories.
And the French tire maker Michelin is struggling to source the synthetic rubber required for their tires.
Supply chain managers are warning of production cuts of up to 30% across all these industries. The input costs are skyrocketing, and those costs are inevitably going to be passed down to the consumer at the grocery store.
It just demonstrates the extreme fragility of a hyper-globalized economy. A shipping lane closure halts a potato chip factory a continent away.
It's the butterfly effect in real time.
It really is. Now, that exact fragility is why politicians in the West are pushing so hard to bring manufacturing back home. But the second business article we're looking at on the U.S. manufacturing renaissance shows that reversing globalization is incredibly complicated.
It is not a simple flip of a switch.
No. We're looking at a report out of South Bend, Indiana, analyzing the mixed results of U.S. manufacturing policies under both the Biden and Trump administrations.
And looking at it impartially, the macro policy narrative from Washington often clashes heavily with the micro reality of these industrial communities. Well, in South Bend, you see a catchwork economy. On one hand, you have massive growth fueled by defense contracts, like AM General, building military Humvees and solar energy parts booming due to the Inflation Reduction Act.
But on the other hand, traditional auto and EV sectors are stalling out. It's almost like the gentrification of the industrial sector.
That's a fascinating way to put it.
Think about it. You have Amazon being a massive $11 billion data center. That sounds great on a spreadsheet, right?
Huge investment, yeah.
But it soaks up all the skilled local labor and drives up land and utility taxes, which ends up squeezing out the traditional century-old factories that can't afford the new overhead.
This also highlights the double-edged sword of tariffs. Tariffs on imported steel might create a boom for a domestic steel producer,
Mhm.
like Cleveland-Cliffs.
Because they don't have to compete with cheap imports.
Right. But those same tariffs severely hurt a smaller metal-bending factory down the street that now has to pay astronomically higher prices for its raw materials to build its actual products.
So there are winners and losers.
Always. Despite the political rhetoric of a universal renaissance, U.S. manufacturing jobs are actually down 100,000 since the beginning of 2025.
Wow. Okay, while the U.S. manages the economic friction of policy shifts, another nation is grappling with the perpetual existential crisis. Turning to the foreign section, we are looking at an analysis of Myanmar.
Specifically, the aftermath of the 2021 military coup and the recent general elections held between December 2025 and January 2026.
And again, looking at the geopolitics here impartially, what are the facts on the ground?
Following the 2021 coup, the military declared a state of emergency. This effectively rolled back a decade of quasi-civilian democratic progress that had been building since 2011.
Right.
The recent phased elections must be viewed through this specific lens. Official military figures report a voter turnout of around 54 to 55%, which is a steep drop from the 70% seen in 2020.
And even that 55% figure is highly contested because major opposition forces were explicitly excluded. Which makes me wonder, if large parts of the country couldn't even participate safely, what is the actual strategic point of holding the election at all?
For the military establishment, these elections are not about democracy or representing the will of the populace. They are procedural instruments.
Tools for control.
Exactly. They are used to manage, contain, and project a veneer of legitimacy over their control of political forces. The military-aligned USDP won a massive majority, as was predetermined by the exclusion of the opposition.
But the reality on the ground is far more fractured, isn't it? The reporting describes a massive patchwork of military control, localized resistance groups, and ethnic armed organizations.
And they're all essentially running their own parallel administrations. The country is no longer governed by a single chain of authority.
Meaning everyday people have to figure out who is actually in charge of their town on any given day.
Exactly. Healthcare, education, and the local economy have shifted into informal, localized channels out of sheer necessity. It is a state that is fundamentally unresolved.
Locked in instability.
It is locked in a prolonged period of instability, where the centralizing instincts of the military continually clash with the federal aspirations of a highly diverse ethnic landscape.
And, when a state is unresolved or when institutions fail to provide basic infrastructure, it is often the community and civil society that steps in to build the safety net.
Which is a perfect transition to our last piece.
It is. That brings us to our final piece today, a beautiful historical look from the Friday Review at Tamil Theater's Philanthropic Legacy.
This is a remarkable piece of cultural history from the early to mid-20th century. It highlights how Tamil theater wasn't just weekend entertainment. It was a highly organized, vital social safety net.
The article looks specifically at C. Ramanujacharya.
Yes, a civil servant who founded the Madras Secretariat Party in 1917.
It's amazing to think about the scale of this. This was essentially the 1920s equivalent of a massive star-studded telethon like Live Aid.
Basically, yeah.
But it was sustained locally over decades by dedicated government clerks who were just moonlighting as actors.
Ramanujacharya was the director, the lead actor, and the composer. They staged 198 performances and even toured the Malay states in 1937 with hit plays like Nandanar and Raja Bhakti.
That is dedication. And they raised a ton of money.
They raised over 5 lakh rupees, which was an absolute fortune at the time. This was for causes like World War II funds, flood relief, and critically, the Ramakrishna Mission Students' Home.
They literally built physical brick-and-mortar institutions that still exist today just by putting on stage plays for their community.
It perfectly illustrates the power of localized, community-driven art to step in and build lasting infrastructure when it is needed most.
It really does.
Which leaves us with this final thought for you to mull over. If a group of amateur actors in the 1920s could crowdsource literal palaces for the poor using just stage plays,
what untapped power does our hyper-connected modern digital culture have to build lasting physical safety nets today? Thank you for listening. If you want to provide suggestions, please contact on the Twitter handle given in the episode description. As always, we are eager to hear what our listeners want to be informed about. We wish you a great day.